Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook, all of which are linked in the description box. Don't forget that you can support me on Locals, Locals, Subscribe Star, and Buy Me a Coffee. And as per usual, I will, at the end of the show, engage with chat. Super chats will be read first. Other chats will be read as time permits or are relevant to the discussion. So tonight, episode 38 of the casual stream, Democracy and the Machine. We could also call this Nemarchy. So Nemo is Latin for no one, hence a little reference to Captain Nemo in the thumbnail. And ocracy or democracy means the rule of or rules, so the people rule. So in this case, no one rules. And so when I say the machine, what I mean is I'm trying to use this word as a catch-all for a couple of concepts. One is the sum total of the entire global apparatus of organized technique, as described by Jacques Ellul. The idea of the conquest of man by tools, aka systems, or Illich's idea of the system society. And it's a convenient catch-all phrase that most people intuitively understand, and as such will get what I'm getting at. And if they need any more specific details, they can watch earlier episodes where I get into this. So what I mean, looking in the chat, we have Jeannie, Brass, and Minoan. Hello, everyone. So yeah, no one's in charge. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that the machine is in charge, but no one is in charge of the machine. So that means that no one is in charge. And there's three reasons why I think this. One is the complexity of the machine. One is the origin and existence of the machine. And then the other is internal contradictions within the machine. We also have Charlemagne and Kai Mokata. Hello, hello, everyone. Okay, so we'll go to the first part. The first part is super complexity. The machine is so large and super complex that no intellect or group of intellects can control it. Or rather, I should say, can understand it. Imagine a man who runs his own business and has, say, 10 other men working for him. If he is intelligent, he might be able to understand each of the 10 roles and maybe even do them himself, as well as how they work together for the larger whole, i.e. his business. Now imagine the same man managing 1,000 men and understanding how they all work together. He probably cannot see the whole. Maybe a board of intelligent men could, but we're pushing it. Now imagine 1 billion parts. And on top of that, each part is so specialized that it takes a university degree in specialized knowledge to understand it. No possible collection of intellects could understand that machine. Now we get to the point of hypercomplexity, where the machine becomes more like a force of nature, so vast and incomprehensible that no man can finally gauge it, let alone fully gauge it, let alone control it. Speaking of controlling the machine is like saying one can control a hurricane. And so when we talk about the idea of controlling a thing, what that implies, there's certain presuppositions that go into that. One of them is that, the one who's seeking to gain that control, or the group of individuals seeking to gain that control, believe they have sufficient knowledge of a thing, right? There's this saying, knowledge is power, right? And so if you understand a thing well enough, you can tell yourself that you can control it by taking advantage of the knowledge that you have. But as the thing gets away from you, so for example, the entire ecosystem of planet Earth is so big and vast that no one can possibly understand it. One of the things that you hear from critics of the climate theories is that, the Earth is so huge, so big, how do we know the inputs and the outputs? And that's something you hear a lot from conservatives, which that's a fair enough point, but then they'll forget that point when it comes to the machine. The machine is so complex that no one can possibly know how it works, how changing one part of it would affect other parts. And all of a sudden, the skepticism of making definitive claims about hypercomplexity goes right out the window. Well, no surprise there. Money's down the line for these people. So that's the first one. The second thing needs to be set up. There are two concepts that help set this up. The idea that the machine is autonomous. And by autonomous, what I mean is that it's sort of independent and self-existing. So now, at least. One is we have Lewis Mumford's The Technical Complex. And what by that he means a series of partial inventions that combine into an ensemble. This unit begins to function when the greatest number of its constituents have assembled, and its trend is towards continuous self-perfection. We have Charles Maurras's Collective Incubation. Collection of millions of accumulated experiments was the preparation for the moment of formulation of expression. All right. Now, then Ellul says, and these are the ideas that I get from Ellul, the machine's origins were autonomous. Ellul argues that in the 18th and 19th centuries, in a totally unplanned fashion, technique as we now know it originated. Now, that's not saying that techniques for discrete things such as farming or warfare or artisanship didn't exist in the past. Of course they did. But these techniques were not the sort of sum total of relationships that man related to. Man primarily related to other men or to the natural world, animals, plants, life, or the weather, the environment itself, the water, the land, the different conditions of snow and hurricanes and whatever, rather than to technique itself. And so tools, as I've already stated, with Illich were organal up until around the 13th century. So these were seen as an extension of the user, where the telos of the tool was wrapped up in its relationship to the user. And that's what was, and then of course we get the distal age, where there's a distinction between the two, and the tool is perceived to have a telos in itself. That's right at this inflection point, where, for Mumford, it's the complex becomes so well assembled that it can now, in a sense, direct itself to self-perfection, or the culminating point of Charles Maurras's Collective Incubation. Okay, for the first time, we see the orientation of man and technique, where technique becomes the dominant relationship that man directs himself towards. In a material sense, we could also say in a spiritual sense, man used to relate himself to God or the gods. Ernst Jünger said that the metaphysics of modernity was technology, so technique has replaced God in this capacity. One can easily see this as too much of a good thing, right? So technique leads to efficiency, which leads to getting your work done on time, which leads to more leisure, and that makes a lot, that's good, right? And so you just keep doing it. Well, more of it's good. More of it must be good. Ignoring the law of diminishing returns, you just keep doing that. Yet this seductive trap leads us to a perverse efficiency for its own sake, which leads to burnout. This leads to more and more complex systems, and as Tainter points out, overinvestments in complexity lead to collapse. So the idea being that we'll just keep on being more and more efficient. But when you get across Europe, because this is where the Industrial Revolution begins, and you could say also partly in North America with the United States, as these discrete professions, whether it's metallurgical profession, metallurgy or extracting raw materials out of the ground, or even just human logistical transportation efforts. As all of these techniques become sufficiently refined, there's a threshold by which they can then all interface, because it's just even more efficient to do that. And it's that interface point, sometime in the late 18th, early 19th century, which leads to this ensemble that creates the technical complex, as Mumford calls it, and is the culminating point of Charles Maurras's Collective Incubation. Now, at this point, leading up to this point, there was no central planner that said, we are going to create this technical mega machine that will unite the world, and we're all just cogs in the machine. This process, Ellul says, you could say begins around the year 1000 and then continues to our own day. Well, the year 1000, according to Illich, would still be the age of Organon. So nobody at the time was envisioning the tools. So man believed he could use tools to conquer nature, but instead the tools conquered man. And now man is a subsystem of the tools. Nobody in the year 1000 thought this. In fact, I don't think anybody in the year even 1900 thought this. Maybe a handful did, but this was a sort of autonomous process. And now that it has its own culminating point, what has now happened is that sort of like the Mickey Mouse skit from Fantasia, where he creates this autonomous magic where now, everything gets out of his control, and he's just, what do I do? Magician's Apprentice, that's sort of what's happened. Where now we've got to the point where, remember, Mickey Mouse didn't want to have all of these mops and buckets turn into this autonomous, self-maintaining machine. He was just trying to, cut corners and get ahead. Do this here, do this here, do this here. But there was a culminating point of the technical complex where everything just kept going all on its own. And Mickey Mouse didn't know what to do, so the senior magician has to come in and turn it off. Of course, that's basically, from our vantage point, just a subsystem. We're not the vast, bloated global system we see today. So, of course, it's a lot harder to just turn this thing off. And so now it imposes costs on man, right? And so now it becomes where man is dependent upon the machine for his very existence. I'll hint at this a little bit tomorrow when I do my discussion on the 3rd chapter of The Machine Stops. And so now it's kind of leading man by the nose. There's this kind of autonomous nature to it, is in order to make more complex arrangements, more efficient arrangements together, it's creating pressure. And then man has to conform to that pressure, because if he doesn't, he'll be left behind and not have food, clothes, or shelter, because the mediating process by which he acquires these things is the machine itself. So I've got some notes collected, some quotes collected from Ellul himself, which illustrate this point. But how can anyone fail to see that none of this holds today? Technique has become autonomous. It has fashioned an omnivorous world which obeys its own laws and which has renounced all tradition. Technique no longer rests on tradition, but rather on previous technical procedures, and its evolution is too rapid, too upsetting, too integrate the older systems. That's what Toffler calls future shock and what Rod Dreher calls liquid modernity. This fact, which we shall study at some length later on, also explains why it is not quite true that a technique assures a result known in advance. It is true if one considers only the user. The driver of an automobile knows that he can expect to go faster when he steps on the accelerator. But even in the field of the mechanical, with the advent of the technique of servo mechanisms, this axiom does not hold true. In these cases, the machine itself adapts as it operates. This fact makes it difficult to predict the final result of its activity. This becomes clear when one considers not use, but technical progress, although at the present time the two are closely associated. It is less and less exact to maintain that the user remain for very long in the possession of a technique, the result of which he can predict. Constant invention ceaselessly upsets his habits. So a note that I took was, within a limited framework, one can reasonably predict what an increase in efficiency will mean. If you cause the automobile to go faster, you will reach your destination sooner. The problem is when technique untethers itself from tradition and earlier techniques, your frame of analysis in terms becomes obliterated. Everything is a variable, and when all factors are variables, you cannot define anything. And so now, as we keep on shattering through frames, and everything is held up for question, it becomes literally impossible for any individual or group of individuals to determine what results for man, for the environment, for the machine itself will happen with an incremental increase in efficiency in just one area, let alone all the areas in which it's taking place. The autonomy of technique must be examined in different perspectives on the basis of the different spheres in relation to which it has this characteristic. First, technique is autonomous with respect to economics and politics. We have already seen that at the present, neither economic nor political evolution conditions technical progress. Its progress is likewise independent of the social situation. The converse is actually the case, a point I shall develop at length. Technique elicits and conditions social, political, and economic change. It is the prime mover of all the rest. In spite of any appearance to the contrary, and in spite of human pride, which pretends that man's philosophical theories are still determining influences in man's political regimes, decisive factors in technical evolution, external necessities no longer determine technique. So, in order to unpack all of this, I think that the most direct way of saying it is this. Prior social interactions, prior economic structures, prior political structures were conditioned by how they responded to pressures from nature. So, famine, droughts, hurricanes, other men, war, conquest, or trade, something external and organic. Whereas now all of this, economics, politics, social conventions, are determined primarily by how they relate to the machine. Because the way the argument goes is, well, if the Soviets build a satellite and send it into space that can send a nuclear missile down to America, cutting the delivery time in half, then we got to do it too. Because if we don't do it, if they do it and we don't, we're going to lose. And if we do it and we don't do it, we risk them getting ahead of us. It's this efficiency trap. And so everybody now is trying to be more efficient. And that is the overarching. And then, of course, but now there's material structures that exist that are the result of technological progress, which further impose on us. So now it is imposing the sphere of activity on us. Humans don't anymore try to relate to each other or try to relate to the natural world. They try to relate to the machine, hence Illich's idea of systems. However, there are spheres in which it is impossible to eliminate human influence. Now, he wrote this in 1954, so this might be a little different today. The autonomy of technique then develops in another direction. Technique is not, for example, autonomous in respect to the clock time. Machines, like abstract technical laws, are subject to the law of speed and coordination, presupposes time adjustment. In his description of the assembly line, Gideon writes, extremely precise timetables guide the automatic cooperation of the instruments, which, like the atoms and planetary system, consist of spheres, separate units, but gravitate with respect to each other in obedience to their inherent laws. This image shows in a remarkable way how technique became simultaneously independent of man and obedient to the chronometer. Technique obeys its own specific laws, as every machine obeys laws. Each element of the technical complex follows certain laws determined by its relation with other elements. And these laws are internal to the system and in no way influenced by external factors. Yeah, that's the machine process that Thorstein Veblen talks about in the theory of business enterprise. It's seeking to become hyperreal by excluding natural inputs that might disrupt the smooth flowing of things. It is not a question of causing the human being to disappear, but of making him capitulate, of enduring him to accommodate himself to technique and not to experience personal feelings and reactions. Exactly. I've talked a lot about this elsewhere. The other thing I'll say, though, is now we have robots. Japan has automated factories. Is the machine trying to create its own repair mechanism so that it doesn't need humans? Now, he's right about time being a constraint, so maybe nature... Well, ultimately, natural forces, I think, will prevail, ultimately, as the machine sort of peters itself out. The machine is kind of like Morgoth that spreads itself. Its essence is bled out as it seeks to dominate and control nature and man. But how long this game can be played is anyone's guess. Though I think we're a lot closer to the end than we were 100 years ago, when this was just getting started. It might be objected, who cares what the real causes were if the result is respect for man or for nature? If technical excess brings us to wisdom, let us by all means develop techniques. If man must be effectively protected by a technique that understands him, we may at least rest assured that he will be better protected than he ever was by all his philosophies. This is hocus pocus. Today's technique may respect man because it is in its interest, in part of its normal course of development to do so. But we have no certainty that this will be so in the future. We could have a measure of certainty only if technique, by necessity and for deep and lasting reasons, subordinated its power in principle to the interests of man. Otherwise, a complete reversal is always possible. Tomorrow, it might be in technique's interest to exploit man brutally, to mutilate and suppress him. Tomorrow, more like the 21st century, we have, as of now, no guarantee whatsoever that this is not the road it will take. Oh, and as of him writing this, we could see this in socialist countries where you have, prison camps and gulags. On the contrary, we see all around us at least as many signs of increasing contempt for man as respect for him. Technique mixes the one with the other indiscriminately. The only law it follows is that of autonomous development. To me, therefore, it seems impossible to speak of technical humanism. So, this is interesting too. So, okay, in what sense is the machine autonomous, right? It's autonomous. Okay, that's not to say that it's independent wholly from man or nature. It can never be wholly independent of nature. And in a theological sense, it can never be truly independent of God. But in a sense, the machine can theoretically become independent from man. So it's not that it's not in its evolution over time. Yes, it was dependent upon man. Man made the machine. Man used technique to create the machine through, what we might call Lewis Mumford's technical complex or Charles Maraz's collective incubation. But once we reach the point where the collective incubation reaches its maturity and is made manifest, then it operates on its own, independently of any of man's decisions. In fact, man still makes decisions, but in reference to the machine and supporting it, which now leads to my third reason why I think this will all end, or why the machine is autonomous, rather. Internal contradictions. So in the age of technocracy, so technocracy means the rule of the technicians. And this is something that, I've talked about before. I've also quoted J.F.C. Fuller in his History of the Second World War with the New Priest class. You might say that this begins with the Progressive era, sometime after the American Civil War, the 1880s, and goes all the way up until, I don't know, probably the digital age, sometime in, the early 2010s. And this is where the illusion of control of the machine was still believable. And the people that made the decisions in our society were those that were the technicians. If Mr. Magic Man in the white lab coat came up and, said, well, this is the best policy, we got to do it. Well, everybody in politics is like, yep, we got to do it. Let's do it. He was the priest, he was the equivalent of the priest who told the king in the Middle Ages, well, the Pope told me to tell you to do this. And he's like, okay, I'll do it. And that's sort of where we're at. I don't think we're there anymore because now the machine is so vastly complicated and absurdly big. I mean, hence the mishandling of COVID and the supply chain disruptions. A sort of like non-conspiratorial reading of that would just be everything is so vast and complex, especially with the people we have in charge, that they were not up to the task of doing this. So, but they manage problems in a society which were viewed as discrete issues, right? So there's this social issue over here, this social issue over here, et cetera, et cetera. These issues would be treated in isolation. So one group of scientific managers would devise scientific solutions for their social problem. Then in a totally unrelated area, another group of scientific managers would create their own scientific solution. But the thing is, though, because these were discrete problems that were being solved and these scientific managers were not talking to each other, they were operating oftentimes completely, again, autonomously from one another, and they had different assumptions. So not only did they have different fundamental assumptions which would clash in the long run, the way they tackled one problem in one area, as that consequence radiates throughout the system, is going to run into contradictions from other solutions that were developed and that will radiate out, and that will lead to a conflict. So, yet over time, the arc of each process leads to a contradiction, where the success of one process leads to the destruction of the other. These men are either dead or no longer in charge, so the course of these subsystems of the machine are echoes of their thoughts. So they're still operating, they're still being maintained and managed and kept up. But now it's just this sort of like tidal wave just coming in. There's no one consciously behind it anymore. They are propelled by inertial forces rather than conscious volition. These inertial forces will clash and lead to self-destruction. This is what happened in the USSR. So many on the right, I used to believe this as well, believe that the collapse of the USSR was an inevitable result of socialist contradictions. And I think as far as that goes, there's still a kernel of truth in that. But ultimately, the real contradiction was a technological society, and that the Soviet Union merely presages what's going to happen to our civilization. Now, remember, they pursued autarky. They weren't on the international exchange with their ruble. So, of course, their fall could be self-contained. It was a part of the globe. It was a subsystem within the global system that collapsed. But it wasn't the heart or the hub of the entire system. That's the United States. And when that happens to the United States, well, watch out, everyone. That's when things get real bad. And so I think that that's the main point I want to make with that. So, and what makes this autonomous is these internal contradictions are not anymore the effects of men's direct volitional choice, right? It's almost like the machine has become sort of like the ancient gods of the Greeks and the Canaanites and the Babylonians and Egyptians, these sort of cruel, capricious deities that we believe are, this very survival depends on our food, our existence, our clothes, and our shelter. And they impose these harsh measures on us. So we try to placate them. So we're trying to placate the machine like you would Zeus or Baal. And it's going to have about the same effect. But what the machine does is it sort of exists in space. And this, I think, is one of the most prescient points that Jacques Ellul makes. The new milieu has its own specific laws, which are not the laws of organic or inorganic matter. Man is still ignorant of these laws. It nevertheless begins to appear with crushing finality that a new necessity is taking over from the old. It is easy to boast of victory over ancient oppression, but what if victory has been gained at the price of an even greater subjection to the forces of artificial necessity, of the technical society which has come to dominate our lives? He wrote this again in the 50s. Looking back from our vantage point, this was prophetically visionary. That is exactly what we've done. And of course, what the machine does, it imposes materialism on us. Well, of both kinds, right? The sort of worship of wealth and consumption, that kind of moral fault of materialism. But more to my point, the philosophical materialism of what Lewis calls the fallacy of nothing butter. It's just nothing but atoms, nothing but an arrangement of physical objects, as if there's no deeper spiritual or metaphysical reality to it. Because the machine can't really account for that. It seeks to remove that variable from its calculations. And so it's exactly what's happened. But what makes this even more terrifying and difficult to deal with is if it were an emperor or a dictator, one could theoretically, gain access to his court and make some sort of appeal, however unlikely it would be of being successful. But who do you appeal to when the machine is doing this? It's this autonomous process that's constricting us like a boa constrictor. I don't really see how you could appeal to that. This is where it becomes more like these primordial forces of animism, where like you try to use magic and charms to appeal to the spirits in the wind and the water in order to have, not be wiped out by a flood or, get sick by contagion. And this will probably have just as much effect. So to sort of sum up everything that I've said, I've sort of christened this thing Nemocracy. No one rules. The machine is operating according to its own laws, independent of organic and inorganic matter, as Ellul says, for its own self-perfection, as Lewis Mumford says. But now it's just inertia. It's this inertia of what's already been developed. Okay, so first, it's super complex. Too many moving parts. Each moving part takes a lifetime of study to be able to fully understand. So no one individual or group of individuals can fully understand this whole process. And given that knowledge is power, as one's knowledge of a thing decreases, one's power over a thing decreases to the corresponding degree. And our knowledge of this machine has gone way down. You might be able to fool yourself into believing you could understand and control it in 1890, even 1950. But as of 2023, this is a pure fantasy. And of course, because there's things that didn't exist before that we barely understand. And so as our knowledge of it decreases, and even the things we thought we understood led to results that no one expected and interact with each other in ways that no one expected. And so we've had this corresponding decrease in understanding, which means an increasing and corresponding decrease in power. So you can't control it. And you'll hear this both on the right and on the left, people saying, well, if we could just gain control of this, we can implement our vision. Well, one, you can't gain control of it for the reasons I just described. And even if you wanted to impose your own system through it, it would be distorted, because these abstract ideas that right and left want to impose are such that it can't mesh with the machine, right? The fundamental material realities, we have to interact with the machine. And so if we don't, and if these ideas don't, then they get chucked out, which is why every time a right-wing or left-wing leader gets in, their platform is always heavily diluted. Second point, the machine is autonomous. Its development is autonomous. Lewis Mumford's technical complex, Charles Maurras's collective incubation. What Ellul says is, we've moved from relating to man and nature to relating to the technique. And then that has led to this own sort of self-development from the inertia behind it. Thirdly, we have the internal contradictions, where the machine has within itself these ideas of subsystems that were designed by the technicians when they were in charge, sort of. Well, when they could deceive themselves into thinking they were in charge. And they certainly seem to be dictating policy to the rest of us. So they were in charge of us, if not in charge of the machine. And so then what you have now is internal contradictions appearing. We already saw this with the Soviet system. You could argue that because it was more rigid and fixed, it was less able to adapt to these changes. But as the frame disappears, as Ellul says, where manipulating technique in one area no longer produces an easily predictable outcome, like the accelerator pedal of a car, the whole thing breaks down. Because let's go all the way back to the Theory of Business Enterprise by Thorsten Veblen. You have to have everything, the only thing that changes is the one thing. It's the interstitial adjustment. Everything else is the same. you have to freeze the whole process and then change one part at a time. That's becoming impossible, as Ellul says. You can no longer do that. You can no longer hold these things frozen, even theoretically, and then manipulate one thing because of super complexity, because of the idea that it's you don't know all the parts involved now. And so this whole thing, the very frame under which this thing is possible, Veblen's machine process, is becoming impossible by the development of that process. It's quite a mouthful. So one thing I want to look up here is something from the Theory of Business Enterprise. Theory of Business Enterprise. There's something very important here that he says about the machine process, which I want to repeat here. Look, okay, the whole concert of industrial operations is to be taken as a machine process, made up of interlocking detail processes rather than as a multiplicity of mechanical applications, each doing its particular work in severality. The comprehensive industrial process draws into its scope and turns to account all branches of knowledge that have to do with the material sciences, and the whole makes a more or less delicately balanced complex of sub-processes. Wow, he basically just described Lewis Mumford's technical complex that wasn't even invented yet. He wrote this in like 1905, I think. Looked at in this way, the technical process shows two well-marked particular characteristics. A, the running maintenance of interstitial adjustments between the several sub-processes or branches of industry. Wherever in their working they touch one another in the sequence of industrial elaboration. And B, an unremitting requirement of quantitative precision, accuracy in point of time and sequence, in the proper inclusion and exclusion of forces affecting the outcome, in the magnitude of the various physical characteristics, weight, size, density, hardness, tensile strength, elasticity, temperance, temperature, chemical reaction, actinic sensitiveness, etc., of the materials handled as well as the appliances employed. This requirement of mechanical accuracy and nice adaptation to specific uses has led to a gradual pervading enforcement of uniformity to a reduction to staple grades and staple character in the materials handled to a thorough standardizing of tools and units of measurement. Standard physical measurements are of the essence of the machine's regime. But we don't have standardization anymore. We can't, because as things keep moving faster and faster and faster and faster, it annihilates the frame by which we can even develop standardized measurement. And the only thing that's supposed to be changing is the interstitial adjustments that were made in the process. So, but now we have subsystems or sub-processes, as he calls it, acting independently of each other. So there's changes that are going on that we're not even aware of, let alone able to control. And so I would argue that this whole thing is going to careen to a catastrophe based on its own internal contradictions. And these are the internal contradictions that brought down the USSR. For example, the Inca Empire was socialist in the sense that everything was, commonly owned by the Incas until they were conquered by the Spanish, who had guns and diseases. The Jesuits pulled this off in Paraguay, though not in any sort of industrial scientific sense. And then, the idea that we've traded one tyranny for another. Ultimately, this idea is a mad fantasy of escaping limits. well, there you go, right? As Ellul said, the limiting frames are just annihilated by this process. But it's the desire to avoid limits of nature, of social convention, of theological norms that man has appealed to the machine in the first place. So it's a sort of this underlying reason why men would buy into this. But it turns out that it creates complete subjection. It's basically a headless automaton. It's a golem, right? It's Dr. Frankenstein's monster. It now acts on its own and is going to sort of blunder around and do damage until it destroys itself and anyone that gets in its way. So that's what I mean when I say that the machine is autonomous and that we are living in a democracy. No one is in charge. So what do we have in the chat? Jeannie Brass. I must give this a thumbs up on the description alone. Here we go. This ought to be as fascinating as your steelmaning of the elites vid. Thumbs up. Well, thank you. Minoan, why do you think the West is so susceptible to the machine? Or in other words, how did the West build a bigger machine than ever before? Okay, that's a good question. And it's a complicated one. But I'm going to try to answer it succinctly and briefly because that could be a whole nother video all in itself. There's a certain theory. So there's a problem there's not a problem. There's an observation, right, in history called the Great Divergence, where around 1500 European civilization skyrocketed ahead of Eurasia, the rest of Asia and Africa, and certainly the New World, and then began to take over. So one explanation for the Great Divergence is that after the fall of the Roman Empire, European nations never were able to reconstitute that political unity. So in China and India and the Middle East, empires would rise and fall, but the sort of anarchy between empires would be limited. It would eventually be reconstituted. Nothing like, the Holy Roman Empire tried. The EU's done a lot better of doing this. And so what we see is that when you have all of these competing states, especially in war, but also economics and other things, what do they want? They want more efficient ways of beating their enemies. And that leads to innovation. We saw this in China in the Warring States period, 700 to 200 BC roughly. We saw this in other parts of the world. But this process wasn't stopped. There was no new empire that took over. This continued for centuries, for a millennia. Really, from the fall of the Roman Empire until the EU, we don't really have any sort of dominant political structure for the European continent. Obviously, you had experiments. France tried, Germany tried, but they all failed. The Holy Roman Empire, at best, was a very weak version of all this. And so, this sort of culminating point that Mumford and Moraz are talking about was the result, I believe, of these nations competing well over a millennium. This period of competition doesn't exist in China or India or the Middle East or Africa for such an extended period of time. Either because, in the case of sub-Saharan Africa and the New World, they were at a very low level of technical development to begin with and showed no interest in moving further. And China, India, and the Middle East would constantly recoalesce, which means, well, we don't need to compete anymore because we're, the barbarians on the outside, these rubes, they're no threat to the, kingdom of heaven, the celestial dragon emperors, no threat from them. So they stop innovating. But in Europe, that didn't stop, right? The Roman Empire fell and they kept competing. And that competitive drive amongst nation states led to ever more efficiency. And I think this created like a sort of like critical mass, which led to an explosion of technical innovation, which then became, the machine, as we call it. So I think that's why Europe was susceptible. There's a lot more I could say about that, but I hope that explains. Let's see. GF. It kind of makes sense, but don't you think it can get Marxist in the way that it will force the world to follow autistic desires for more efficiency using more cruel methods? I mean, it could try, but we're already seeing supply chain breakdowns. We're already seeing resource limits. We're already seeing, again, the very precondition, the machine process itself breaking down because we can't maintain a frame where we can just do tweak, because again, the interstitial adjustment works, at least in theory, because we believe if we adjust technique over here with a little bit, we have a predictable result that we can see, right? And as Ellul says, that might work for an automobile, but that may not work anymore. We have the idea of what he calls servo mechanisms. This axiom no longer holds true. And so, but technique created this, but it created its own demise. It's very, very interesting. Let's see. Ellul makes it seem like the machine is greater than God. Thoughts? I don't think so. I think what we need to understand here is that the machine itself is a hyper-real simulation which seeks to parody nature, which it cannot ever completely efface because it's fundamentally dependent on nature. It's like imagine a cartoon where there's I guess you could say God, or a large hand being held out, and the machine is another man standing on that palm saying, I don't need nature. And then the joke is, well, you're standing on nature. You still need raw materials to exist. You can't draw sustenance from yourself. And so, in this regard, it's not eternal, even though we'd like us to believe so. And tune in tomorrow night for my discussion on chapter 3 of The Machine Stops. We'll get a little bit more into that. It's also not omnipotent, though it likes us to believe it is. Most of this is the hyper-real matrix of consumable artifacts that the machine gives us, so that it makes itself seem more real than the real when it's not. Kai Mokata, Snow Golem. Maybe. Doug Bone, I think this is the most accurate framing we have. Hopefully more adapted. Well, I hope, thank you, 1. And 2, I hope so. Because what I've seen is over the last 25 years, I've been involved in political analysis and all this stuff. The classic 20th century views of the right and the classic 20th century views of the left have completely, utterly, totally failed to deal with any of the problems we're dealing with in the 21st century. The sooner we get rid of them, the better. And I think the likes of Ellul, Illich, Mumford, Moraz, Virillo, and others create the framework for understanding what we're doing. That guy asks, hello, just dropped in like your video on classical politics. Well, thank you. That guy asks, thoughts on neo-medievalism. I've not heard of it as an organized movement. I suppose I can guess at it. Ideally, what we need is a way to maintain our own existence without relying on the machine directly. That's not the same as saying we don't use it or interact with it. It's attempting to be omnipresent, so it's impossible to avoid interacting with. But what is possible is not depending on it. My Makata, is it over? Well, I think it's over for the machine. I think that the sort of like the black pill is the machine is collapsing in around us. Again, the theme of tomorrow's video. But two, there's hope even there that there's going to be people that are outside that can endure this and carry on. It's only over if you give yourself wholly over to the machine. All right. Well, everyone, I know that's a lot to digest, and I've just dumped a huge amount of information out there. But I hope this explains why I think that that no one is in charge. Because right now, is it communism? Is it capitalism? Is it bureaucracy? I know people are fond of the bureaucratic revolution, the managerial revolution. Sure, I mean that's there's some value to that, but like we're at this very attenuated level here where it's like none of it works. Nothing works anymore. Well, super complex system beyond man's comprehension is falling apart. And man is flailing around inside trying to figure out what to do. Here we go. Explanation. That guy, yes. Neo-medievalism is a prediction of the future in international relations. Basically, we go back to medieval levels of decentralization and competition. Thank you. That's very... Yeah. Yeah, that's likely. We're going to go through a series of catabolic collapses. I don't know where we're going to end when that's over. Maybe. Let's see. That guy S. Also, globalism and localism will happen at the same time in this paradoxical way. Yeah, because what happens is we go through catabolic collapses, different subsystems fail before others. And it's going to be very difficult to predict what that's going to be. But as we have subsystem collapses, we're going to have to figure out how to make do without. And the people that can do that, and what that process will lead to, hopefully, is people who realize that they have to do without the machine completely, not just with some subsystem not with just some subsystem collapse. And that's what I want to do. I want to get to the point where it's like, okay, yeah, we're gonna have to ride this wave down. We're gonna have to start, phasing out our reliance on subsystems. But I want to get rid of all subsystem reliance, basically, and just be like, we're gonna operate autonomously outside the machine. All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. This is Todd Lewis of the President's Folly Podcast, signing off.